Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland, and behind me is John Lennon's house on Montague Square in London. So John Lennon should need no introduction, but here goes. To people who are much younger than me, he may not be so familiar, but I was born just not very long before he was killed. But I obviously grew up knowing all about him, listening to Beatles music, and I remember about 1990 there was a huge wave of enthusiasm for the Beatles again. There was that Beatles anthology came out in about 95. Anyway, so John Lennon was one of the Fab Four, as they call them, the Beatles, perhaps the most famous one, the first to die as well. So he was born in Liverpool in 1940 during the Blitz, and his middle name was Winston, and his parents gave him that in honour of the then Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, although John Lennon came to disagree with Winston Churchill about most things. Liverpool was quite badly hit during the Second World War because it was a port city, quite an industrial city, so vital to the war effort. So he grew up in a working class family, but the money wasn't that tight. They were reasonably well off, but his parents had a difficult relationship. I'm not sure if he had any siblings actually. So I'm trying to remember which school he went to. I don't remember, but he went to some art school later on. Was it Liverpool Institute? That was his school, where he overlapped a bit with Stephen Norris. Well, poor John Lennon. Anyway, when he was at this art college, he met these other guys: Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Ringo Starr. And there was another one, I think it was Stuart Sutcliffe. You might even have seen Backbeat, came out about 1994, about the fifth Beatle, Stuart Sutcliffe. Now, I say that John Lennon was the first to die, but Stuart Sutcliffe died in his early 20s before they became famous. So it's a film about him. And then they formed a band called the Quarrymen. Now, Ringo Starr wasn't strictly speaking part of their band. He would just play the drums for whoever was on that night for several different bands. But they were the most successful, so he stuck with them. And then they moved to Hamburg in Germany. And they played gigs there, and the nightclub they worked at doubled as a brothel and so on. But it was discovered that one of them was the youngest one, I think it was George Harrison, was 17 at the time, and he couldn't legally immigrate, so they all had to leave the country. That was when Germany was still divided, West Germany and East Germany, and obviously it was so soon after the Second World War. There's still quite a lot of ill feeling, and not many people in Germany spoke English back then. Loads of them do today. I don't know if these guys learnt any German. They're not noted as linguists. So anyway, their first LP was 1963, and obviously that went up like a shooting star. And before long they were world famous, not just in this country. So I can't name all their albums, they're not in order, but like Help was one of them by the mid-60s. There are a number of Beatles films you might not have known that came out in the cinema, which were only semi-successful. You can see them all on YouTube. Well, there's a famous photo of them in black clothing lying on the snow to spell out the words help. What was it? Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Heart Club Band was one of the most famous songs. So they really made the 60s. So it just wouldn't have been the same decade without them. And so they toured the United States. They played at this extraordinary sellout concert at Shea Stadium, New York. Most of their fans seemed to be teenage girls who were just absolutely in hysterics over them, wildly crying, swooning for these guys. So they were real sex symbols. I suppose, well, there were three of them quite good looking. I don't think Ringo Starr, with the best will in the world, can be said to be physically prepossessing. But anyway, so George Harrison was the quiet one. The lyricists were mainly John Lennon and Paul McCartney. In the 60s, they were quite, what would the word be, conventional, safe to begin with. These were guys with the short back and sides, clean-shaven, wearing suits and ties to go on stage and play their music. But by the end of the 60s, it was all different. They had hair down past their shoulders, they had shaggy beards, and they were wearing psychedelic colours. They were totally into the counterculture. They were more or less the shock troops of it. Now, I know they didn't do it on their own. Obviously, many other people, other musicians, writers, artists, and so forth, who led the charge. They were influenced as well as being influencers. And they went to India and they met a certain yogi, as in some wise man, a spiritualist, and they spent some time at his ashram, and they felt they gained some insights from him. One of their songs is Revolution, but one of the crucial lines is, I can't remember how it goes, but when it comes to violence, you can count me out. They were against the use of force, and they were just too young for national service, because up until this time, young men had to spend 2 years in the army, the Royal Navy or the Royal Air Force, unless they were medically exempt or unless they were a sort of a career criminal. But that I don't know how they quite avoided doing it, because some people in 1940 were called up and did their 2 years, and some of them weren't released till 1963. You didn't strictly have to do it when you were 18. It might be slightly older, like 19 or 20 when you started. So that would have been a seminal experience for them. I'm sure they're very glad to have missed out on that one. So they weren't explicitly political. They never endorsed any political parties, so far as I know. They were certainly against America fighting in Vietnam. Or John Lennon, he famously protested with a sign saying "Britain murdered Hanratty," about James Hanratty. Was he the fourth last man hanged? This is a highly controversial case. Was he innocent? But nonetheless, he was put to death. I could do a whole video about that one. So they began smoking cannabis and thinking this had impressive results. I'm not sure they're ever into alcohol, but they became incredibly wealthy just very fast indeed. So 1968, he was living here, and Jacqueline Dupre was living up the street about the same time. And then they later moved somewhere else. It was on Devonshire Street, which is around here. You can't quite see it. It's a bit out of the way. So they were just world renowned, became wildly popular. I know people in Malaysia who were young back then who said that they idolized the Beatles. I'm not sure how they came up with a name. Was it like the car? They appeared on that Ed Sullivan show in the United States. Anyone who was anyone in the musical world was on his show, popular music that is. It was kind of an odd thing because he was quite an old guy, had an old-fashioned style, wearing his suits and his hair brill creamed back. You think he was a strange choice to be impresario of such a broadcast. So what else about the Beatles? And they had their song back in the USSR. I'm not sure actually if they played in the Soviet Union at the time. So they didn't even tour that much around the United Kingdom. They did a bit, then the United States. I mean, once they were hugely famous. In the early days, they performed a gig in Paris, and I remember seeing Paul McCartney saying they seemed to be these rather middle-class, slightly gay-looking young men who were their fans. I'm not sure. Maybe that's who it appealed to. So by 1970, all of them were married, breaking a lot of hearts. He'd been married very young actually, because his girlfriend was pregnant at the time. That's the sort of thing you need to do, but it was a catastrophic marriage. They split up very quickly. But later he met this Japanese photographer Yoko Ono, who was a couple of years older than him. And remember, the Second World War was something they very much grew up in the shadow of, and so there was still some Japanophobic sentiment here. But he married her. I think he had one child with her, and she's still alive, I'm pretty sure. She appears in that video for Imagine, which is a peace song. So they were part of the peace movement, the campaign for nuclear disarmament. They believed in that, the legalization of drugs. Were into anti-racism as well. Well, by 1970 they all split up. I'm not quite sure why. I mean, we imagine that they had a fabulous relationship. Maybe they found it slightly difficult to all this fame so young, all this money so young. I mean, the dums, my heart bleeds. You could have a worse outcome. But being together so much, some artistic disagreements. Abbey Road is one of their famous albums made here in London, and there's at that Abbey Road studios, and some bizarre sounds were coming out of there. Musicologists said it shouldn't work, but anyway, it did. And there's that famous album cover of them walking across the zebra crossing in front of Abbey Road Studios, and a lot of tourists go there to try and replicate it, and those people leaving tributes or writing things on the wall and so forth. There's a Beatles cafe near there which tries to cash in on the fact it's about half a mile from Abbey Road Studios, but it's really not worth it. It's the most measly little cafe. Yeah, 1970 they split up, and they all took different artistic directions. John Lennon moved to New York. Now, Elvis Presley was very against them by this stage, and I think it was partly envy, because he'd been the rebel of the 1950s and seen as a threat to the establishment. And then he was meeting Nixon, although he was wearing these bizarre capes and so on. Remember, in the early 60s, Elvis just stopped performing, and in the 70s he started again, leading up to his death in August 1977. For about 5 years, he was getting fairly big. But when he was getting, well, big in the other sense, as in morbidly obese. But anyway, he was writing to Nixon saying these guys are bad news. They come here to make their money, then they go abroad to spread anti-Americanism, and they're encouraging children to abuse drugs and stuff like that. And there's a famous documentary, the United States versus John Lennon, the attempt to have him deported. David Shaler, who was a British MI5 agent, as in Secret Service agent, said MI5 kept a file on him, and in the file are things like the lyrics of some of his songs, as those couldn't be easily publicly accessible anyway. So he made a song about his situation, Working Class Hero. And if you look up the website www.workingclasshero.com, you find out information about John Lennon. He had an Irish ancestry, incidentally, with the surname Lennon. Woo! There was a guy in Cork in the 60s and 70s, also named John Lennon, but no relation of his, so far as I know. But Lennon, some of my pupils got to mix up with Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, revolutionaries of the 20th century. Of course, in centuries to come, 1917 and say the 1960s were seen as quite close together, and people would easily get them confused. So, and then, well, I don't want to talk about the other ones too much because they're all doing different things. They all got an OBE in the late 60s under Harold Wilson when he was Prime Minister. Was he just trying to assiduously court the youth vote? And when the Ulster Troubles broke out, I think it was Paul McCartney, they were all Liverpudlians, who produced the song Give Ireland Back to the Irish. Well, Republic of Ireland, we obviously are separate from the UK. Northern Ireland's part of the UK because most people there want to be, and the Republic of Ireland agreed to it in 1921 by a treaty, which was ratified by Dáil Éireann, every single member of whom was a Sinn Féiner, which was then upheld in an election where 75% of people voted for that. So Ireland does belong to the Irish, but I mean, the Republic has agreed that the North is part of the UK, although most people in the South have sort of welched on that agreement time and time again. Although 1998 it was reconfirmed by the Good Friday Agreement, a wildly popular agreement, 85% of people in Ireland voting for it, saying that Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. Most of us who voted against were Unionists, thought it wasn't Unionist enough. Anyway, so back to the current situation. So Mark Chapman was this loony who stalked him for a few days. He'd been reading was The Catcher in the Rye, and then Lennon got out of his taxi at his apartment building, was paying the cabbie, and was shot dead by Chapman, who was arrested sometime afterwards. So Chapman got life imprisonment, and then Yoko Ono's always opposed parole for him. So far as I know, he's still incarcerated. The news broke shortly before Christmas 1980, but he had no public funeral. He was very quickly cremated, so I think some of his fans were robbed of a chance to mourn him. Paul McCartney, unfortunately, was sort of buttonholed about it by a journalist as walking casually along the street, and he saunters up to the camera and he makes a few offhand remarks, but the thing is, it didn't come across that he was tristful enough. People thought he ought to be mourning in a more public and obvious fashion, and he didn't seem to be someone who's terribly bereft, so a lot of people scorned him for that, said that he was just blasé, just dismissed his friend's death, or should I say former friend. Anyway, he took his own route with his band Wings. I think it was dreadful. Mull of Kintyre appreciate, but most of the rest of it was dreadful. So I know he got into vegetarianism. Was it Paul McCartney? Was it even veganism? I'm not sure. He's Sir Paul as he is these days. Don't know if the other ones were knighted. So that was John Lennon. I don't know where his ashes were scattered, but he's obviously been immortalised in music. And then he had two sons, I say, one of whom, I think it was Julian Lennon, about 1990 launched his own musical career. Was one song, Saltwater Wells in My Eyes, seemed to be a bit of a one-hit wonder. And the trouble with that is, well, nothing grows in the shade of a great oak tree. I think Randolph Churchill said it, because his father was so magnificent, he's always going to be compared against his father unfavourably. Who can possibly match up to such a reputation? On the other hand, we mustn't feel too sorry for him. His name is going to open an awful lot of doors. He had so much money behind him, so much cachet, name recognition. The studios were willing to listen to his stuff when they wouldn't listen to it as by somebody else, to at least give him a chance. Anyway, so that is John Lennon, who brought just incalculable pleasure to millions. Toodaloo.